So once again we are back. Today we are dealing with the arches of foot. I'm Dr. Gaurav, and without wasting any time, let me move forward with the slideshow. So our foot is designed in the form of elastic arches or springs, So the foot is not flat by nature, and the spring-like action of the foot helps it to propel forwards. So our foot has got a shock absorbing component, which is referred to as the medial longitudinal arch, as well as a component which helps to transmit the weight. So the dynamicity of the foot is such that it is made up of arches, and these arches help in propulsion. So the classification of the arches of the foot is as follows. We have got the longitudinal arches, which are the medial and lateral, and transverse arches, which are anterior and posterior. So arches of foot are shown here along the longitudinal axis. Along the lateral border of foot, we have the lateral longitudinal arch shown in green. Along the medial border of foot, we have the shown in orange is the medial longitudinal arch, and red line going transversely is showing the anterior transverse arch here. So we have the anterior and posterior transverse arches. So first we'll do the medial longitudinal arch, that is shown by the bony component of the arch is shown by orange color here. So this arch acts as a shock absorber. The anterior end is formed by the heads of the first, second and third metatarsals. So it's on the medial side, and the heads of the first, second and third metatarsals, they form the anterior end, while the posterior end is formed by a tubercle in relation to the medial aspect of calcaneum known as medial tubercle of calcaneum. Main joint of this arch is the talocalcaneo-navicular joint, while the bony factor for the arch is the talus. So each arch has got a summit. Summit is formed by the superior articular surface of body of talus for the medial longitudinal arch. The anterior pillar is formed by the talus, the navicular, the medial, intermediate and lateral cuneiforms, and the first three metatarsals, while the posterior pillar is formed by the medial half of calcaneum. So if you get a note on medial longitudinal arch, do mention how it is formed: anterior end, posterior end, anterior pillar, summit. What are the bony components of the arch? Now this is showing you, now we concentrate on the lateral longitudinal arch, which transmits weight in contrast to medial longitudinal arch, which was acting as shock absorber. So this lateral longitudinal arch is lower compared to, and it is more rigid compared to the medial longitudinal arch, and its main function is to transmit the weight. So here the anterior end is formed by the heads of fourth and fifth metatarsals, while the posterior end is formed by a lateral tubercle of calcaneum. Main joint is calcaneo-cuboid joint, and the bony factor for the arch is the cuboid bone, which lies on the lateral side. So this is the lateral longitudinal arch. Now the summit is formed by the articular facet on the superior surface of calcaneum. Anterior pillar is formed by cuboid and fourth and fifth metatarsals, while the posterior pillar is formed by lateral half of calcaneum. So when you get a note on medial longitudinal arch or lateral longitudinal arch, describe the anterior and posterior ends, the pillars, the summit, the bony components of the arch, and then you describe the factors responsible for the maintenance of the longitudinal arches, which are shown in this table 1. So what are the factors responsible for maintenance of any arch? We have got the intersegmental ties, which hold the different components of the arch together. Now this may be a muscle or a ligament. So for the medial longitudinal arch, it is the spring ligament which holds the different components of the arch together, while for the lateral longitudinal arch we have the plantar ligaments, both short and long. Now what are tie beams for an arch? Tie beams are those which unite the two ends of the arch. So for the medial arch we have the medial part of the plantar aponeurosis. For the lateral arch we have the lateral part of the plantar aponeurosis, and then we have the medial half of the first layer of sole muscles, so that is abductor hallucis and medial part of flexor digitorum brevis, while for the lateral arch we have the abductor digiti minimi and lateral part of flexor digitorum brevis. What are slings for an arch? Slings are those which pull up the summit of the arch, the highest point of the arch. So for the posterior compartment, is divided of leg is divided into superficial, intermediate, and deep parts. So muscle of intermediate part, flexor hallucis longus and digitorum longus, and tibialis posterior, they act as slings for medial arch, while muscles of lateral compartment of leg, they act as slings for the lateral arch. And suspension of the arch is formed by the stirrup, that is formed by tibialis anterior and peroneus longus. For both the arches, medial as well as lateral longitudinal arch, this suspension is by the stirrup, which pulls the middle of the foot upwards, as we did in the class on leg. So factors responsible for the maintenance of arches, how do you remember them? Intersegmental ties, well, that is the spring ligament for the medial arch and the plantar ligaments for the lateral arch. The medial half of the first layer of sole along with medial part of plantar aponeurosis, they act as tie beams for medial arch, while the lateral half of first layer of sole muscles along with lateral part of plantar aponeurosis, that acts as tie beams for the lateral longitudinal arch. Muscles of intermediate and deep compartment of the posterior compartment of leg, they act as slings for the medial arch. Muscles of lateral compartment act as slings for the lateral arch, while the suspension is provided by the stirrup formed by the tibialis anterior and peroneus longus, which pulls the middle of the foot upwards. We did there, tibialis anterior is coming from the medial side and the peroneus longus is coming from the lateral side, and both of them lift the middle of the foot upwards. So describe the factors responsible for the maintenance of the longitudinal arches also, if you get a note on the longitudinal arches. Now we come to the anterior transverse arch. This is formed by the heads of the 5 metatarsals. So one can make them out here. It is complete because the heads of first and fifth, so this is the head of fifth and this is the head of first, they come in contact with the ground, and these two are the two ends of the arch. Posterior transverse arch is, however, incomplete. It forms only half dome. So it is formed by 3 cuneiforms, cuboid bases and shafts of 5 metatarsals. So know the composition of the posterior transverse arch. Anterior transverse arch was formed by the heads of metatarsals, while the posterior transverse arch is formed by 3 cuneiforms, cuboid and bases and shafts of 5 metatarsals. It is incomplete because only the lateral end is touching the ground. So one can make out here only the lateral end is touching the ground. So to see the complete structure, we have to consider the arches of both sides. So arches of one posterior transverse arch of 1 foot, it is incomplete. When we consider the posterior transverse arches from both the sides, only then the completion is there. So each posterior transverse arch forms only half dome, which is completed by similar half dome of opposite foot. Now once again we have the factors responsible for the maintenance of the arches. Again we have intersegmental ties, tie beams and slings. So dorsal interosseous muscles, they are acting as the ties which hold the different parts of the anterior and posterior arches together, while tie beams, that is the ones which are joining the two ends of the arch, for the anterior arch are adductor hallucis and deep transverse metatarsal ligaments. For the posterior arch we have got flexor hallucis brevis and intertarsal and tarsometatarsal ligaments. So slings for the anterior arch and the posterior arch, well, they are the same muscles, the deepest muscle of the posterior compartment and superficial muscle of the lateral compartment. So you have to know these table 1 and table 2 when you describe the arches. Now we come to applied anatomy of the foot. What happens when there is absence of arches, and this may be congenital or acquired? Then that condition is called flat foot. So naturally the spring-like action of foot is gone, the shock absorbing power of foot is gone, so the foot easily gets damaged by trauma and is prone to arthritis like changes. So the foot is not able to propel forwards effectively, and the loss of concavity of sole can also cause compression of nerves and vessels of sole. So recruitments to the army or in jobs where you require physical fitness, in that case if a person has got a flat foot, the arches are not proper, then that person is not considered because the propulsion of the foot is not proper in the absence of arches. So the shock absorbing function, the spring like action of the foot is not there, and the foot is more prone to get damaged by trauma, arthritis, or nerve compression. So all these cases of flat foot, they are not considered uh, um, relevant for jobs in the armed forces and so on, so where you require a lot of physical fitness. So flat foot is a condition where there is absence or collapse of arches of foot. If there is exaggeration of longitudinal arches of foot, that is, the arches are more pronounced, the longitudinal arches are more pronounced than normal, then that condition is called pes cavus. So pes planus was when there is collapse of arches, absence of arches, and pes cavus is when there is exaggeration, when there is the arches are more pronounced than normal. So causes of pes cavus are spina bifida and poliomyelitis. And next we come to the club foot, which is the commonest congenital anomaly of foot. So three conditions have to be met before we describe a case as club foot. The foot is inverted, so the lateral border is lifted, medial is touching the ground, adducted, the foot is adducted, and plantar flex. So as you can see in this diagram, the foot is inverted, adducted, and plantar flex. So this is the commonest congenital anomaly of foot. So with this we complete today's class and the portion of lower limb. So I thank you for being with me. Till the next time we meet, bye from my side.